Should magic level or technology be the same across a whole world setting? And how do you approach this as a world builder? Big question.
Yeah, I mean, my knee-jerk reaction would be to say no, because I can't think of many things besides like oxygen that spread evenly around the world. But yeah, and I think there's actually a case in that's more dull too, right? In which we know natural resources. There's certain areas that are naturally resource rich on our planet, and those aren't necessarily distributed evenly, right? So I mean, there's certain, and that's what makes trade, right? That's why people, it's like, okay, you got a lot of coal, we got a lot of wheat, so it's Catan in real life, right? But,
right, exactly. I want your cinnamon, but I have wool. Let's do this.
Right, let's make it happen. And I think that's where too it would stand to reason that magic would work differently. And you think too about different cultures, and you can go do deep dives. I mean, this is where too Wikipedia is such a great rabbit hole to start going down and figuring out, okay, well, if China had gunpowder, where did that come from, right? And you can follow links to figure out where that came from. But we know that different cultures have different languages, they have different cultural practices. So why would their technologies or their magic be the same worldwide? They wouldn't, right? I mean, like, even if it were the exact same thing, they would have other ways of dealing with it, of working it into their society, of using it as a currency or some sort of economy. So I think thinking that through, and again, it's that issue of scope, like how big is your world? I would imagine that you could have a large city, like a medieval Rome or London or something like that, which could be pretty much used the same from end to end. But then when you start moving to that world next door, whatever that is, the Muslim world or whatever it would be, how are those things being treated very differently? And those are those markers too, in which it's always fun. This is one of the things that I was saying during the break, that I'm teaching this advanced world building independent study. That's one of the things that I'm really asking them to do right now, is to develop two worlds that are geographically pretty close to each other, but then imagine one traveler moving from one to the other and figuring out what's different in those places. And it's like, oh, well, we never use magic to butter our croissants, right? I mean, like, that's the thing where it could be something mundane like that doesn't have a major effect, but you'd notice it, right, when you move over. And it's like, oh, I've never thought about that before. And if too, thinking about how technologies have advanced, it's like, it's seeing what the other person's doing and then bringing that home and saying, how much can I adopt this? Or could we adopt it in a new way? You know what I mean? Take what they had and adopt it in a new way. So I think it would be really almost a cop-out if it were to be the same everywhere at the same time. Because even if you think about, I was thinking too about the rise of the internet and how that happened in the 90s throughout the 2000s, and trying to talk to my students who are now on their 20s. It's like, well, it was only like if you went outside any urban area, you couldn't get internet, right? Or it was so painfully slow dial-up that you really couldn't do anything. And it was like that for a while, right? For decades before it really started to get this infrastructure. Yeah. And it's not hard to think about how those kinds of slow rolling out would happen. And it could be the reverse. Maybe magic is like abundant in the fields, that you need to harvest the magic and then refine it and then bring like the end product to the cities to be used. You know what I mean? There's just so many different ways that you could do it. But I think it's really useful and productive to not just say it's the same everywhere, because whenever anything is the same everywhere, that always smells like a cop-out to me. That it's like, it's too hard to actually do the work to figure out the way that it works, right? Or the way that it got that way. But yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I would sort of say is, where is it most productive? That's always the thing too that I always advise people. And when you're building this big world, and maybe it's got an enormous scope, you really got to get down to like the rubber on the road. Like, why is this going to matter? And so maybe keep bringing that scope down, and until you figure out, well, this is the contact point of where the difference between the magic and the technology, it's in this city or in this neighborhood that really is where things are happening. It's crackling, and it's going to have to go one way or the other, because those are always the most interesting points of tension, where you can see sort of thrown into stark relief, these decisions, especially the point that puts an individual character into a moment of choice, right, where they need to decide which way they're going to go. So yeah, so I think it's always, I rarely will say everything needs to be the same worldwide, because it just smells false.
Sure, absolutely. And there's a lot of I always talk about being end product focused when we're talking about world building. Now, that is not to say that you should be building your world exclusively for the end product, because one of the wisest things that Trent has ever said to me is, the biggest world building problem I see is that the world is designed specifically for a single character or characters to exist in. And that is a problem, because it makes the world feel false, and it makes the world feel flat. Yep. But if you are being end product focused, which is one of the best ways to not get world builder's disease, think about why it matters, and how you're going to tell a great story with it. So there's all sorts of different ways that you can do it, particularly with magic, because whilst technology is usually, it's going to, if you're on a single planet in the same atmosphere everywhere, the technology will work. If you take it under the ocean, it might have an issue. If you take it into a different atmosphere, it might have an issue with corrosive materials. But generally, that technology will work wherever you take it. That does not have to be the same with magic. So magic can be tied geographically, or tied to specific peoples, or reliant on specific materials which are geographic. And that can give you some really good variations to stop your magic feeling too ubiquitous, I would say.
Yeah, that's a great example. I was thinking too, I remember a high school teacher who taught physics was on a cruise, and he was going to do something on constellations, and the cruise boat went from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. And then when he went outside, he's got this crowd of people.
The sky is wrong.
Doesn't know anything, right? And it's like, all right, what's going on? So when you're saying that, you know, the geography or the technology could work, or rather the magic of the technology, that's like one example in which if you made a world that happened, you'd probably be like, that can't possibly happen. The sky looks completely different in one part of the world, and it's like, well, actually, there is a basis for that. Going back to what you'd said, I mean, this is where too some of the advice that I give in terms of writing for fiction writing is the exact opposite. And like even things that I've said about starting with a character and starting with an interesting character. A lot of times when we're doing these world building projects, I say, don't worry about characters yet. What we want to do is figure out where are the tensions in the society. And then you start thinking about, you know, who would be an interesting character is this person who would tell
this story the best.
Who would tell this story the best, who would find themselves at that point of tension. Because I think for whatever reason, that feels more organic, because we don't get to choose the world that we're born into. So it feels a little bit more organic that a character would be born into a world that they didn't have a say-so, rather than coming up with a character and saying, okay, well, this character has all of these traits, and now let's make a world in which it's like they walk out their front door and everything is waiting for them to happen. I think it's a slight thing, but psychologically, I think it works in your mind in terms of like thinking through who the other people would be then too, rather than just thinking about that protagonist. Who are the people who are going to try and push it one way or the other, and then how does that put that character sort of in the middle of all that conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. Remember though, guys, if you are making a world setting that has more than one planet, if you are making a setting with different planets, or if you are making a setting with different atmospheres, you can create this kind of variance within your technologies as well. So the technology of a species from this planet will not work on this planet because of electric interference, because of a different environment. There's all sorts of ways you can do this. And again, the minute that you are talking about magic and technology, as for example in Star Wars, there's even more interactions that you consider about why something may or may not work in a certain place, or it may work but do something completely that you didn't expect. You might have a completely different interaction.
Yeah, I think too, one of the things that there's so many things that I keep thinking in the back of my head I got to get out, so hopefully they'll all get out. But thinking too about how, like in science fiction, unless you're really creating a world that's about hard science fiction, and most world building projects aren't, you don't really need to get that deeply into the physics. So we know, like in Star Wars, the hyperdrives are always breaking down. We never get a technical analysis of why it's breaking down. We just sort of understand that, you know, our computers break down, you know, the audio in the stream doesn't work right. We don't quite know why, you know how to fiddle around. Or
it's presented as black box syndrome because we don't need to know more unless there is a plot point there.
Yeah, and Ray pulls out the compressor and says, well, this is the thing that, and it's like, we'll just go along with that, right? So thinking about that as well, too, that's a fine line between just sort of just hand waving at everything and not having it make any sense. But I really like that idea of being like, oh, well, you know why this compass doesn't work. I mean, like compass declination for people who do things in the outdoors, that's another thing, right? Where if you're in the Pacific Northwest, or if you're in the United States, or if you're in, you know, wherever, if you're closer to the equator, your compass reads differently, and you need to adjust for that based on the magnetic poles. So if you're following what you think is true north and you've just traveled halfway around the world, you're not going to wind up where you think you are, no matter how good of a navigator you are. So those are things too that are fun to sort of think through. And the level of complexity there, either you can go way down into the rabbit hole and you design, you know, something that you're never going to need or use. Going back to your point, it always needs to have that, what's the end goal. But I think there's a lot of times in which we were just saying too, that over the break, I don't really know how my cell phone works. I kind of understand there's towers and there's relay stations, and all those kind of things, but not really that well. And you think about the vast majority of the technologies that we use, there's a good deal black box syndrome around it. The other thing too that I was just advising students to do this past week is go online, and you can find technical readouts for like absolutely every piece of technology. Go find some repeated phrases, draw on those, you know what I mean? And it's the same thing. You could use that with magic. Go back to alchemy texts. There's a lot of really interesting alchemy texts from the Middle Ages now that you can get on Google Books and see translations of them. And it's fun. It's just like, imagine if they would have been right. You know what I mean? Like, just instead of it being some weird, crazy alchemy thing where you can't turn lead to gold. Well, imagine if you could, right? Or some similar process.